Once again, welcome to NCST's May Community Impact Briefing. My name is Raquel Reddy, the Vice President of Community Development here at NCST, and I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Garland, our Community Development Manager, who will be introducing our presenter today. So if you were here for the Community Impact Briefing, Creating a Brighter Future for America's Housing, you're at the right place. So thanks for joining us. And Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Raquel, and so excited to welcome Ben Preis, who's the Director of the National Housing Crisis Task Force and Senior Research Fellow at the Nowak Metro Finance Lab. As Director of the Task Force, Ben is responsible for all deliverables and day-to-day activities, and in his role at the Nowak Metro Finance Lab, he leads the lab's work on national, state, and local housing policy. Ben has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, including Urban Studies, Urban Affairs Review, and Annals of American Association of Geographers. His work has been profiled in popular media outlets such as Vox, Governing Magazine, and NPR's Marketplace. Ben has previously worked with the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh, the Cambridge Housing Authority, and the Center for Public Studies in Santiago, Chile. In previous roles, Ben worked in government relations for universities and research associations at Lewisburg Associates. He holds a master's degree in city planning and a PhD in urban science and policy from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and received Bachelor of Science in Physics and Peace and Justice Studies from Tufts University. On today's call, titled Creating a Brighter Future for America's Housing, Ben Preis will address our nation's current massive gap in housing supply versus demand. The need for coalitions focused on housing production and preservation remains at the center of building a housing ecosystem that can provide immediate as well as long-term solutions. The bipartisan National Housing Crisis Task Force was formed by a coalition of ambitious leaders and practitioners to identify and scale the most promising innovations in housing production and preservation. The task force focuses on 5 key segments of housing interventions: land, construction, capital, regulation, and governance. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Ben Preis to today's NCST Community Impact Briefing, as we're set to learn more about the task force national housing vision and guiding principles that support their mission. Ben, I think you are all set to share your screen, so I will turn the controls over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Raquel, and thank you to NCST for hosting me, and for all of you for joining me today on this Wednesday afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. So as Chris said, the National Housing Crisis Task Force is a relatively new organization founded 9 months ago as a bipartisan group of practitioners meant to identify and scale the most promising state and local interventions in housing today. And the origin story of this task force is really the rallying cry that we are in a housing crisis. And of course, that crisis is not a new one. While I think the common knowledge of the housing crisis really spiked during the COVID pandemic and the years following, as housing prices increased rapidly across the entire country, we know that this crisis has long been bubbling up. There have been secular trends going back decades, related to immigration and changing household size and demographic changes. We had an acute crisis during the global financial crisis, the Great Recession, that really changed how housing markets worked in this country. And then most recently, the COVID crisis. And of course, we can't forget that for a long time, this was a crisis of low-income communities, low-income households, and in particular coastal communities, but really nationwide. And it's only recently that the popular imagination has really realized how deep and broad this crisis is. At the core of this crisis is an undersupply of millions of housing units. We simply haven't been building enough housing in this country for a very, very long time. And this is caused by numerous different contributing factors, right? Everything from a high cost to build, especially for affordable housing, a lack of zoned land for housing, to complex capital stacks. And of course, this leads to an increase in homelessness and high cost burden. But we don't just have an undersupply crisis, we also have an insurance crisis, a preservation crisis, and oftentimes a preservation of scattered site single-family homes in addition to affordable homes, all of which contribute to crisis at the individual and household level, right? People who cannot afford to buy a house, to pay their rent, to stay in their homes, to pay their increased property taxes, or a new roof or insurance premiums or what have you. And so this was the backdrop of the crisis that brought to the fore the National Housing Crisis Task Force. And so we are a bipartisan group co-chaired by the governor of Utah, the mayors of Atlanta and Cleveland, and the president of the Fifth Third Bank CDC. And then we have 24 task force members, and these 24 task force members were meant to be practitioners that represent all parts of the housing ecosystem. And so we have individuals from the housing finance agency community, public housing authorities, we have developers, we have investors, we have an architect, we have community advocates, we have community foundations, really trying to say, if you are part of the housing ecosystem, we want you at the table to help us think through solutions. We have a research advisory committee comprised of researchers from the top research centers across the country. And then our partner organization on this task force is a national nonpartisan network called Accelerator for America that has 15 mayors on their advisory council standing by to say, we are going to actually try the solutions that are put forward in the task force deliverables and actually try to implement them. And from implementing them, we will learn about what works when it comes to diffusing and scaling these innovations. Now, I think those of us who work in the housing landscape know that there is no shortage of innovation. There are people across the country actively trying to solve solutions in their communities. We have over 800 housing trust funds. We have special purpose credit programs from the private sector, building code reform, land use reform. All of this is bubbling up. But it's also really difficult for people to learn about new things and decide that that is going to work in their community, right? So much of this comes down to Mayor A was visiting with Mayor B, who they're friends with, and heard about this cool thing and said, oh, we should try this here. Or we go to conferences and we hear about this thing and we think maybe that will work in my community. And in a country as large as the US, that works okay, but it's certainly inefficient and insufficient for the moment that we find ourselves in with both an acute crisis and a long-term structural crisis. And so the goal of the National Housing Crisis Task Force is at the state and local level to identify these innovations that are bubbling up, to figure out what it will take to scale these innovations, and then to create policy change that can make these innovations routinized and norm across the country. And of course, so much of how that typically happens in the US is from the federal government on down, right? If you want community development block grant money, you have to do this. If you want Medicaid money, you have to do this. We aren't necessarily in a moment right now where the federal government is going to be identifying and scaling these innovations via those policy levers. So we might need new institutional mechanisms, new intermediaries that can do some of that policy change and some of that institutionalization without the carrot and stick of federal dollars. And so the task force has a set of guiding principles, beginning with, as I started, treating the crisis as a true crisis, and 3 deliverables. We have a federal policy agenda that we released last fall, which I'll touch on briefly, a state and local housing action plan, which is the real bulk of the work, and then a national housing vision, which I'll get to towards the end of the slide, but recognizes that the innovations that we have today are not necessarily sufficient to address the challenges of the future. And so we need new ideas, possibly taking models from the rest of the world that can be adopted and adapted here at home. Overall, our goal is to transform the housing ecosystem in the US so that people of all incomes can afford to live in the places they wish to come home. These 3 deliverables each take a different piece of the puzzle when it comes to the housing crisis, right? Our federal policy agenda addressed what the federal government can do and was released before the election with the idea that the 40 recommendations in the federal housing policy agenda could find its home in any administration and in any Congress, recognizing that some ideas would fall better in one administration, then the other, and others in the other administration, then the alternative. And so we have pared down and reoriented parts of those recommendations based on the current political environment that we're in. And of course, there is some opportunity, as we've seen, for example, with the tax bill for the expansion of low-income housing tax credits, opportunity zones, things of that nature. Then the State and Local Housing Action Plan is the bulk of our work, identifying these innovations that can be replicated and scaled. And then that National Housing Vision, again, setting the stage for the radical remaking of the housing ecosystem. Now, one interesting quirk of the task force is that task forces are meant to go away. We don't want to exist forever, and frankly, I think that the work of the existing organizations like NCST, like the other national trade associations, advocacy groups, they exist. They have existed for much longer than we have, and they will exist much farther into the future. And so part of the work of the task force is partnering with those existing organizations to say, which pieces of our recommendations could you lift up? Could you elevate? Could you do some of that diffusion and scaling? And so over the next year, we'll be doing those ecosystem roundtables, talking to members across the country, talking to different constituencies, different parts of the housing ecosystem, and different communities to say, how can you take what we have in this in these deliverables from the task force and make it your own? So that's the level setting for the crisis that we find ourselves in and what the task force is trying to do. And for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to go into details about those three deliverables: the federal policy agenda, state and local housing action plan, and that national housing vision. So the federal housing policy agenda, as I said, was released right before the election and included 39 policy recommendations that were organized in two different ways. One is they were organized thematically. We thought that the recommendations would accomplish the following if implemented: leading and focusing the nation, reducing barriers and eliminating complexity, mobilizing federal capital for production and preservation, innovating with an industrial policy lens, as we've done with climate and manufacturing and defense, and then providing a housing safety net for those who need it. We also organized these recommendations in terms of how they actually get implemented in Washington, right? Is this an appropriations bill? Is this a tax bill? Is this an executive action or rulemaking procedure? And so we really tried to make the set of recommendations actionable for those who have the ability to implement this. And I'm going to put the link in the chat today, right now, to this full report. And so, as I said, we've streamlined this report based on the current administration and Congress and what we think they would have interest in, focusing primarily on those reducing barriers to complexity, and then innovation with an industrial policy lens, really trying to reckon with the fact that construction workforce is shrinking and has not grown since the Great Recession, that the labor and input costs have grown dramatically, and that productivity in the construction sector has decreased since the 70s, even when much of the rest of the world has innovated with techniques like modular and industrialized and offsite construction. And so we've been advocating and educating members of Congress with these recommendations, and do think that there might be an opportunity, such as with low-income housing tax credits, to push through some of these bright spots. But as I said, the real meat and potatoes of this task force was the State and Local Housing Action Plan. And the State and Local Housing Action Plan makes the following argument. In lots of communities, the elected officials will often use their political power to achieve a piece of the puzzle on housing, right? They will do the tremendously hard work of doing land use reform, or the tremendously hard work of implementing tenant protections, or creating a housing trust fund and identifying a new revenue stream for that housing trust fund. And while we appreciate the hard work it is to do any piece of this puzzle, we also know that that's insufficient, that really to change how the housing market works in a community, places need to be doing something in each of these 5 categories: land, capital, construction, regulation, and governance. And when I say places, I mean not just local government, or not just county government, but all layers of the puzzle, right? The state has a role here. Counties and localities have a role here, as do in many cases the local community foundations, the local place-based philanthropy. And of course, most housing in the country is owned, developed, and managed by the private sector. And so while the State and Local Housing Action Plan is really geared towards what the public sector and civic sector can do, they need to be in partnership and in collaboration with the private sector that builds and manages almost all of our housing stock. Now, this slide is what I call our nosebleed slide. This is all of the pieces of the State and Local Housing Action Plan. And if you go to our website, nationalhousingcrisis.org, you can see the beginnings of this plan that we've been fleshing out over the past couple of months, that we'll continue to do so through the summer. And so these pieces of the State and Local Housing Action Plan are meant to be menus from a 5-course meal, right? When you are thinking of changing how public land is used differently in your community, you might do something with a municipal property advisor, as places like Austin have done, or you might set up a public asset corporation like cities like Atlanta and Chattanooga have done. When you are trying to work with modular construction and construction innovation, you might do what Cleveland has done and issue an RFP to actually pre-buy units of modular housing to be sited on land bank land, or you might use state and local programs when it comes to resilient housing for energy retrofits and upgrades to make the housing more resilient to the challenges of the 21st century. And so each of these bubbles here will be a tool in the State and Local Housing Action Plan, and communities are going to need to do the hard work of saying, what are the current tools that I have in my toolkit? And what can I add from this to make sure that I am doing something in land, capital, construction, regulation, and governance? Now, to get this from a toolkit that has a pretty report, designed by a graphic designer, to something that actually makes an impact in the world, we're doing 2 things at the task force. One is we're working with a network of key partners, including our co-chairs, that are elected officials, our mayors, implementation committee, and those other housing ecosystem organizations, to identify what are the places that are actually ready to implement some of these tools within the next year or 2, and then working with those places to commit to action, saying we are actually going to implement these pieces of the State and Local Housing Action Plan, and providing the important technical assistance and implementation work in order to make this happen. But of course, without me being on webinars like this every day for the rest of my life, this is not sufficient to reach the hundreds and thousands of municipalities that we have, or even the 50 states that we have. And so part of the idea is that if a sufficient number of communities implement a sufficient number of these tools, then it will go from an innovation that place A did, but they did because they're special, to, oh, this is something that communities of all shapes and all sizes have the power and the capacity and the capital to do, and it will become a norm. And so as 2 examples of what it is that we're trying to think through, one is around tax incentives and property tax abatements. And of course, many communities turn to property tax abatements in order to encourage the creation of market rate or affordable housing in their communities. But we also know that local elected officials and community members are often wary of those tax abatements and striking the line between developing a program that actually works and makes projects pencils, but not being so generous as to let developers get away with a windfall. And so we're working on creating a interactive open source model that communities can use to try and right-size their property tax abatements, balancing that line between public benefit and private benefit, and trying to achieve the outcomes that communities are trying to achieve when they offer those sorts of incentives. So we released this draft tool back in March. We had outreach from communities outside of sort of that network of our core Mayor's Implementation Committee, and we've been refining the model based on that feedback, with the goal of making a publicly available online model later this year. As another example, our Housing Accelerator Fund tool, which is coming out later in June. The CEO of the Housing Accelerator Fund in San Francisco sits on our task force, And it's a really phenomenal model for California. The San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund has partnered with private individuals and local community foundations to provide the construction capital necessary to create new housing, and has actually done layered on additional innovations, including with industrialized and modular construction. And then they've partnered with the city of San Francisco to say, will you lease up this building with permanent supportive voucher holders on the back end? So they're able to tell their investors when they're developing this new housing, you're not building a new building where we don't know who's going to lease it up at the end. In fact, we know who's going to lease it up, and it's the city of San Francisco. And so we can take away some of that risk that comes with new real estate development by knowing who's going to occupy it at the end. But they're solving a very particular problem, particular to California, right? The layering on of regulatory requirements that come with public dollars, and so turn into private dollars. And so communities across the country, including Philadelphia and Austin, have adapted this Housing Accelerator Fund model, but they're not solving the problems of California. They're solving the problems of Philadelphia or Austin. And so identifying what an abstracted accelerator fund means for communities, this partnership between community foundations, private investors, and the public sector, and how it can solve the problems of a given community that look different than San Francisco or Philadelphia or Austin. So that's the State and Local Housing Action Plan. But what we also know is that the State and Local Housing Action Plan and the tools in it, those existing innovations, are built on a stable foundation of federal housing policy and of state and local ways of doing business, right? Most of the housing trust funds in the world or in the US are geared around playing nicely with low-income housing tax credits or CDBG or home funds, because those are the biggest games in town. And so if we want to actually radically transform the housing ecosystem, we need to go beyond those current innovations to say, what hasn't been built yet in the US? What are the capital solutions? What are the policy innovations? What are the processes and products that can go from Band-Aids on a broken system to building a better foundation, or as I've been saying, what would it look like if we did housing policy on purpose? And so the National Housing Vision is the work of the task force over the next 18 months, saying we have this foundation of federal policy, we have this foundation of state and local innovations. What are the next set of innovations that really try to think differently about housing? And so the National Housing Vision is going to be a series of policy papers answering the following 7 questions. And I won't read all of them, but they really get to the heart of the issue, right? How do we treat US housing as an industry rather than a series of mom and pop landlords, mom and pop developers, large developers, affordable housing developers, capital providers, private equity providers, public sector, et cetera. And really think about this holistically and try and think about supply chains and integrated housing certificates and industrialized construction, et cetera. As I've been saying, quite a bit recently, it is strange to me, and I think strange in a lot of the rest of the world, that while building a car in Detroit and Milwaukee isn't subject to different regulatory requirements from federal and state governments, building a house on one side of a local jurisdiction can put you in a different zoning regime, different building code regime, different financing regime. And that makes it really difficult for housing to reach efficiencies of scale and economies of scale when it comes to when it's so necessary for people to know individual regulatory regimes down to jurisdictions of a few square miles. Question number 4 about building a new, more flexible trillion-dollar capital stack, again, gets to these inefficiencies of doing project-based capital stacks for affordable housing that require the layering of 9, 10, 11 different capital sources, rather than blending those capital sources on the fund side and having a blanket fund that can invest in the housing that we need in communities. And then that question number 7, to loop it back to what I said at the beginning, gets to the fact that in a nation as large as ours, with 50 different state regimes, 39,000 municipalities, it's really hard for people to learn about new things, decide that that new thing will work in their community, and then take the time to advocate for that new thing, either with their boss or with their city council or with their constituents, and say, not only is this a good idea, but it's a good idea that's going to work here, and I'm going to spend my time and social and political and financial capital to make it happen. And so do we have the right set of intermediaries that can do some of that work? I think we've seen some bubbling up. We, of course, have some legacy intermediaries that have been with us for 10, 20, 40 years. But do we have the right sort of intermediaries for the current challenges that we have right now? And so the task force finds itself with its current set of deliverables, the federal policy agenda, the state and local housing action plan, and then working with partner organizations across the housing ecosystem to ensure that the answers to our questions in that national housing vision actually get buy-in, actually get uptake, and can actually make a difference and not just be, as we often say internally among staff, not just another report that sits on a shelf. And so I really appreciate the opportunity from the NCST folks to talk to so many folks here today. And as I reach the end of my presentation, welcome the opportunity for questions, feedback, ideas, concerns, or otherwise. And thank you so much again, Chris and Raquel, for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. This incredible just transfer of information and knowledge. And, as Ben said, we'd love to have an opportunity to welcome any questions that attendees have. Please either use the chat feature or the Q&A to do that, and we'll share that with Ben. So let's just take a quick peek. I don't think this one is, yeah, okay. As we are waiting for folks to see if we have any questions, Ben, I did want to, oh, maybe one came in. No, sorry. I did want to kind of come back to the sense of, the scale of innovations and how you're looking at, capital, where it would come from, including the private sector, as well as foundations and other places. One of the things I had in my mind was how much are you seeing, whether it's local or national employers, participate in these conversations, and how have they been, and where is their interest in terms of providing housing for their employees? I know that one time, this was also tied to some incentives, especially if they were coming into a new market, either to build out a new manufacturing facility in different places. Do you have a sense of that you could share with us?
Yeah, a little bit. So I think we're seeing this in two different ways, right? I think for lots of communities, there's a recognition that without sufficient housing, it becomes an economic liability for communities, right? That without places for workers to live, companies are not going to be able to locate there or grow. And so we are seeing some state level incentives. I think Michigan has a program to partner with employers to try and finance or create housing. And so we are seeing that stream of it. And I think the other piece where this really came to the fore was around the CHIPS funding act, CHIPS Act funding for manufacturing facilities related to semiconductors, right, in places like Arizona, outside of Columbus, Ohio, and in upstate New York, and a real recognition that there's woefully insufficient housing for the number of employees that are expected at these semiconductor plants. And so I know New York State has done a lot of work trying to identify how to scale their housing production. I saw a report from HRNA Advisors that said that Syracuse would need to quadruple the number of homes that they've been producing in like the scale of 2 years in order to meet sufficient demand, first for the construction workers and then for the workers who are actually going to be in those plants. And so I think we're seeing states really play a role of trying to partner with major employers as an economic development play.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. Ben, there's a question here from Cyber Townsend. She asks, I have a particular interest in housing for people with disabilities, both physical and developmental. Is there a subcommittee with the task force or a group that's working on this topic?
Sabra, really appreciate the question. To be Directly, the answer is no. We don't have a subcommittee working on this question as well. I think that a number of task force members who represent different pieces of the housing ecosystem, including an architect, our public housing authorities, and our housing finance agencies, as well as some folks who have come from the homeless advocacy space and the disability advocacy space, often try and bake these ideas into the tools of the State and Local Housing Action Plan. But I know it's an important piece of the puzzle to make sure that we have universal design and housing for folks who need it, for all folks who need it. And so appreciate you raising it here today.
Thanks for that. There's also a question here with respect to the low-income housing tax credit. The question is with respect to LIHTC, how often is it used to develop multifamily buildings, and how often is it to leverage or to build groups of single-family homes? Can this be used to expand more single-family affordable homes?
So LIHTC is primarily a multifamily tool, though it doesn't have to be. I don't have a statistical breakdown of the multifamily versus single family numbers, but I would guess more than 90% of LIHTC development is multifamily, although there are some examples in places like Cleveland. Actually, I know there's a developer, Chris, that has done single family new build with an interesting lease to own model. West Philadelphia had a developer that has done a lot of work bundling portfolios of single family homes and then doing renovation of them with what's known as 4% low-income housing tax credits. And then there is a bill in Congress, although what I have to say about Congress is that even if I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't use it on Congress is my go-to line, called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And NHIA, which came out of a lot of the great work of the folks at NCST, is meant to mirror the LIHTC program for single-family homes. And so is meant to encourage developers to acquire and rehab existing single-family homes, and then provide a tax credit for what's known as the appraisal gap, the difference between how much it costs to develop that home and how much a home sells in communities where it is being developed. And so Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is a proposed program. It doesn't exist in the world, but is meant to be more suited towards single-family homes than LIHTC, which is really mostly a multifamily tool.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
I'll go ahead with the next. Yeah. Chris, I'll go ahead with the next question in the Q&A. This is from Alexander Lazard. I'm in the city of Lafayette, Louisiana, and we've been discussing commissioning a housing needs assessment that would result in the presentation of data that would help to determine what type of housing we need, where we need it, and for whom do we need it. Are there any tools or resources available that could help us refine our RFP? And are there any key things we should be thinking about as we plan this effort?
So a tool that we link to in our own State and Local Housing Action Plan that I really quite admire is localhousingsolutions.org. I just put in the chat. This is an offshoot of the Furman Center for Real Estate at NYU, and has received funding from, I think, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as part of their focus on small and medium-sized cities. And Local Housing Solutions actually has right on their homepage, if you go, is a housing needs assessment that pulls in public data from Policy Map. I always confuse Policy Map and Policy Link, but I think it's Policy Map as a starting point. And then I think the other place I would turn to is the National League of Cities Housing Supply Accelerator, as they've done a lot of work with a field guide, and is really meant to be a how do we get started for communities that sounds like, Alexander, your community is starting with in Lafayette. And so those would be my two places I would look, is NLC's Housing Supply Accelerator and Local Housing Solutions.
Thank you. Chris, do you see any other?
No, I think that's it. I will take a bit of personal privilege though. I'm curious with respect to your next phase. I so appreciate, Ben, the way that you identified some of the roles, right, of state and local government, but then how that's an opportunity for them. And then with respect to some of your, most front and center communities in Utah, Cleveland, and Atlanta, identifying some of those best practices. You sort of alluded, though, to the challenges that local practitioners have in identifying that and then bringing that to the fold, making sure that that's aware. And I wonder if you could talk more about how, when those best practices are identified by the task force, how you're working to, elevate those and communicate that locally.
Yeah, so a couple of ways, right? So we have our, the simplest version is our website with the tools, right? Which is a if you build it, they will come perspective in the world. And of course, we know that everyone has too much to read and too much going on already. I think, the task force has worked over the past year to really establish some partnerships with organizations like the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices to try and get that information out into the trade associations, right? The American Planning Association, organizations like that ultimately can disseminate information to their members. So I think that's one piece. And then I think the other piece, which is underappreciated but really true, is we've been thinking a lot about like how do places learn about things from their peers, right? A lot of what happens is, right, I'm from Pittsburgh, and so right, Pittsburgh will see something that Cleveland did and say, well, like we don't want Cleveland to have a thing that we don't have, right? Or Youngstown will see a thing that Cleveland did and say the same thing. And I think one of the challenges in the US is that state boundaries really do matter, right? What local communities can do are limited by state law. And so thinking about places like state municipal leagues, of, city and town leagues at the state level that can provide some of that information sharing, diffusion, best practices, technical assistance. And then, one of our task force members is former Secretary of HUD, Henry Cisneros. When we were in Cleveland a couple of weeks ago at a task force meeting, he really raised the fact that housing as a topic doesn't have the same educational infrastructure as, say, planning, right? Or, say, architecture or engineering, right? People become housers through all of those fields, but it's not like you can get a master's in housing policy. And so really thinking about what are the educational components that are missing from this housing ecosystem, and then getting back to that question number 7 of do we have the right sort of intermediaries and tools for that diffusion and scaling?
Ben, that's really helpful. And being from Cleveland, I can attest that you're spot on in that dynamic. But it seems like that's a healthy approach, right? Identifying each other's best practices and then saying that that's something that we want to have here as well.
Yeah, and I talked with a professor at BU who has done real academic study of how places learn. And what he shared with me is there are sort of 2 different ways that places learn. They either look to the rock star cities, right? What has New York done? What has Chicago done? What has LA done? Because those are the places that have the capacity, the staff, the expertise oftentimes to try the crazy new thing, right? If New York wants to spend an extra $100 million, like that's almost a rounding error in New York City's budget, whereas for other communities, it is their budget. And so they'll either look to the rock star cities, but it's hard to translate from New York to town of thousands, or they'll look to their peer cities, right? Cleveland and Pittsburgh, maybe Tampa and Jacksonville, right? Like looking either within state to the closest city or to a city of a similar size. And so you need to work within that network of both the rock stars and the well-positioned peers to really have a practice diffuse and scale.
And Ben, I had a question too. I just wanted to quickly ask, and it really goes back to this, what I call a paradigm shift in housing innovation. And when I was, just even by example, when I was first introduced to container housing, I was like, what? And then when I got to really see how it was created, I was with my husband, like, when are we going to get, ours? But at the same time, there is a shift in what we think we want in housing. And I'd love to ask you if you're finding that that's a challenge, or are more people open to that, home seekers more open to that. And certainly want to add in a little bit of an element of multi-generational housing. I saw it was a show on Sunday that was talking about how, more young adults who've now finished their college degrees are not able, as we know, are not able to afford housing in lots of different places, and they're going back home. And is that multi-generational look at housing also starting to increase outside of the sort of the usual cities that we would see that in? Are you seeing it more broadly? So the paradigm shift question, then the multi-generational question as well.
So I think on the paradigm shift, is really interesting, right? Because I think most of our housing in the US is built by developers, and those developers are being financed by investors, and both the developers and the investors are risk averse. And the reason that I lay that out is because it requires someone to take a risk to say, if I build a thing that hasn't been built in this community before, will people move into it? Will I be able to sell this product? And without someone along the line taking the risk, it's really impossible to build a new thing, right? Why would I build an apartment building that is built for multi-generational housing if no one has told me, oh, I want that, right? I think we see this with everything from transportation mode shift to new housing to remote work, right? Like the ability for people who are ultimately the ones building the thing to say, I have an idea and I'm going to execute on it, and see if people will take that up. And the reason I lay all of that out is because ultimately individuals can only purchase or rent what is available for them in the market, and they can vote with their feet, so to speak. Right, like if I don't like the housing that's available for me in this community, I might go somewhere else. But I think a lot of the paradigm is manufactured, right? Like a lot of the paradigm of what we want is the result of what's available to us, what looks good, what our friends have, what our ideal of the American dream is. And so I think it takes everyone to say, we're going to try something new. And an interesting example of this is there's a new development outside of Tempe, Arizona, that is meant to be a completely driverless car community. And it was a developer taking a real risk. We are going to build a car-free community, rather, right? We are going to take a real risk and say there are no cars allowed in this community. It is going to be bikes, it is going to be pedestrians, and if you want to live here, you literally have to park your car at the door. In a place like Arizona, where my perception is everyone has a car, maybe two. And so the developer had to take a risk and say, I think there's demand here, and I'm going to prove it. But he could have lost a ton of money. And so that's one piece. And I think, on multi-generational housing, we have a task force member, Jennifer Ho, who's the head of Minnesota Housing, who has said that she has always thought that aging would be the gateway drug to housing justice, because not only do you have an aging population, but you have shifting demographics in terms of fewer households that have kids, fewer households that are married, aging households that are often single person, and the housing stock that we have is built for families with 2, 3, 5, 7 children. And so, there are some interesting companies looking at the sharing economy, trying to allow for splitting up of those existing houses into single micro units and small apartments, maybe with shared kitchens, that sort of thing. I think that's one avenue. And then, of course, we know that there are lots of communities, especially immigrant communities in the US, that have always done multi-generational housing. And it's a question of, do they have the housing available for them? Are they allowed to do that per local regulations, which sometimes disallows that? And I think it ultimately goes back to, we need enough housing of all shapes and sizes so that everyone can live in the way that they want to live, be it in a car-free community outside of Tempe or in a big single-family house in the suburbs. We just have such a shortage that we need more of all shapes and sizes.
Great, thank you so much for that. Chris, do you want to grab there's one in the chat.
Yes, I do see a question here. I think I know the response, but I'll go ahead and read it verbatim. Ben, would you agree with the statement, currently it is impossible to build affordable single-family homes without subsidy?
I'm going to say probably, but, and this might just be me being an annoying academic, right? I think, but what do we mean by subsidy, and what do we mean by affordable, right? Like I think there are lots of revenue streams that one could tap into to take what looks like a grant or down payment assistance and turn that into something that is recoverable by a financial institution, right? I was just with the folks from Fifth Third Bank yesterday, and of course, one of their members is the co-chair of the task force. And Susan was talking about a neighborhood in Cincinnati where the land trust stabilized the neighborhood following the Great Recession and acquired a whole bunch of homes that had been selling for $10,000. And the first home that they sold for $90,000. And the second home that they sold for $100,000. And the third home that they sold for $110,000. And eventually they stabilized the neighborhood sufficiently that they no longer needed that gap financing for the appraisal gap. Now, what is then, who can then afford to move into those homes at $90,000 versus $200,000 is different, right? And so are we subsidizing the construction, or are we subsidizing the individual? Because that looks really different. And are we subsidizing the individual through tenant-based assistance, or through direct rental assistance, or through a little talked about program like Section 8 home ownership, which can often allow those with housing choice vouchers to bundle their tenant assistance into a mortgage product. And so I think there are different ways to do subsidy. I think there are different ways to stabilize a neighborhood. And so yeah, if you're trying, people of certain incomes can never afford the sticks and bricks that it will take to build a habitable home. But are we subsidizing the housing construction, or are we subsidizing the individual, is a policy choice that leads to different sort of outcomes. And so, John, sorry for like a really long and academic answer, but I think with everything with housing, right? Like it's a constantly shifting piece of a puzzle.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. I think we'll take the last question here in the Q&A. And this comes from J.R. Fleming. Hi, JR. Thanks for your question. So the first one's more maybe of a comment. Chicago is quite creative and utilizes government, CDFI, philanthropy, and community partnerships to get things done. But he says, what recommendations do you have for municipalities and housing organizations who will see shortages in our city due to the federal cuts?
So I think the first thing the places need to do is do a sort of stress test, right? Do an analysis of where is all of the federal money, because I think municipalities don't necessarily have a great handle on all of the different ways that federal funding impacts housing, right? Everything from Medicaid waivers that can be used for homelessness, rent for folks who are experiencing homelessness, to continuum of care communities that may or may not align with jurisdictional boundaries, probably not, to public housing authority operating funds and housing choice vouchers, which local governments may or may not have clear lines of sight into because their housing authority is not technically under the oversight of the mayor. And so the first thing is a stress test, and likely a recognition that some pieces of this puzzle cannot be filled by state and local governments as they are currently constituted, right? The city of Atlanta did that stress test at the beginning and found that their 40,000 households are supported by federal funding, and that the Housing Authority of Atlanta has an operating budget that I think is only 50% of the city's operating budget, right? So if federal funding went poof, the city could not support the Housing Authority for more than like a month. And so it's working with their states to see what can we triage, what can we reconstitute, what can we think creatively about in terms of funding. But ultimately, I think that a lot of the existing organizations will be on the defense, right? The national trade associations like NARO and CLAFA and FADA and all of the other alphabet soup of organizations in DC, right, are meant to advocate with federal policymakers to say, hey, if you got rid of this, here's how many people would lose housing within a week or a month or a year. And so, as I said, no crystal balls for Congress from me. But I think doing that stress test is a reality check of, oh my God, what is the sort of stress that we could be under is a really important thing for communities to be doing right now. And also, I agree with your shout out to Chicago. Marisa Novara, the former housing commissioner, is a task force member and is currently VP of the Community Foundation in Chicago and is doing some tremendous work.
Fantastic. Well, Ben, thank you so much for, that's his buddy. Thanks so much for the presentation, and thanks so much for the dynamic conversation around our questions this afternoon. With that, we're going to move into a little bit of a quick policy update from NCST, and Chris Garland's going to provide that to us. Then we'll wrap up. Chris.
Excellent. Thanks, Raquel. And Ben Preis, thank you once again. Such a pleasure having you on today's call. Yes, as mentioned, we do have something of an update on neighborhood homes, which I know many of you have been tracking along with us. This week, the House Budget Committee is moving forward on budget reconciliation. The current package includes deep Medicaid cuts and makes the 2017 tax cut permanent, but excludes any expansion or permanence of the New Markets Tax Credit or affordable housing provisions like LIHTC, CDBG, Home, and or the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. The House budget bill is expected to be voted on before Memorial Day weekend, so that's sometime this week. Meanwhile, the Senate has yet to draft its version, and so much of the advocacy now shifts to the Senate, where we hoped that these bipartisan homeownership priorities are to be incorporated. NCST, of course, remains actively engaged with members of the Senate Finance Committee to ensure the programs are included, and also working with the Neighborhood Homes Coalition, the Home Coalition, and also our New Markets Tax Credit Working Group through our Homeownership Alliance to advance these policy priorities and promote affordable homeownership for communities nationwide. We encourage you all to reach out to your senators and emphasize the importance these programs have on families, and how the only way to tackle our housing issues is to retain these programs and also pass the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Please reach out if you have questions, and check the Neighborhood Homes website, which I'll drop a link in the chat presently. Check for more information. So with that, a big thanks again to today's presenter, Benjamin Preis, and of course to you, our attendees. Thank you all. Next month's CIB call is set for June 18th, of course, the third Wednesday of the month. We'll look forward to seeing you then. And with that, on behalf of NCST, have a great rest of your week. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you.